person, they said to me that, mysterious they said to me, decent people don't talk about religion and politics. And so I'm somewhat hesitant to introduce our speaker here today. The big issue that occurs to me is that we don't talk about religion and politics.
Rudy, this is horrible.
So far, not so good. It's kind of redundant. That's the real issue. Oh. We don't have a computer in my house. We use Abacus. And the premise of this book is there are foundational ideas behind our arguments. You think you're arguing about tax policy, but you're actually talking about nature, or you're talking about history, or you're talking about religion. So I was excited and thought, oh, I'm finally going to learn how religion is behind lots of our politics. Only to find out that the Jim Caesar book only covers nature and history. Just the first two. I asked him my dissertation was, I said, Dr. Stoner, he said nature, history, and religion. Why is there no religion in the book? And he said, it's academics. He's looking for a second publication. But now I think that book has been written, and I think our speaker today, Dr. James Patterson, has written that book. Dr. Patterson has a BA in political science from the University of Houston, and earned his PhD in American politics, writing under Jim Caesar at the University of Virginia. Dr. Caesar is a fellow at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, and at the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. He is president of the Ciceronian Society, and he is chair of the politics department at Ave Maria University. And today he's going to talk to us about the rise and fall of the Judeo-Christian consensus in American politics. James Patterson.
All right. Snagged that publication right out from Jim. No, he was very supportive, and in a way, what I think the real reason he was uncomfortable writing about religion is he was less well versed in it. So he was glad to have someone like me from the Bible Belt write it for him. So yeah, today's topic is the rise and fall of the Judeo-Christian consensus. One of the questions of the age, it's something that happened and no one noticed, this decline. And so that's how I choose to frame the talk on this book, although the book does cover some other things. So the first thing I always like to point out to people, although I find increasingly people know this, is that the idea of a Judeo-Christian consensus is new. You'll often hear people describing the Judeo-Christian heritage or the Judeo-Christian beliefs as such eternal or ancestral, when really the reason why you have Judeo-Christian as a hyphenated issue is that there's major divisions here, and then within Christian, of course, there's endless division. And the idea that they could achieve a consensus is incredibly unlikely. So it's something that does not emerge until the 1920s, and even then it is under constant revision and challenge. And it also replaced something, namely what Darrell Hart, historian now at Hillsdale, I believe, calls the Protestant hegemony, which is a scary word, but you'll see that it's an appropriate one. So the Judeo-Christian consensus replaces this foundation in Protestant hegemony, but never really remains a stable consensus, primarily because of the changing leadership, but also issue sets affecting the public square. And one thing that I find historians less so, but political scientists like to do, is abstract from the process and de-emphasize the significance of contingencies like the particular leaders that are involved. But I declined from doing that and instead decided to chart this rise and fall by analyzing certain critical leaders in order to illustrate how the Judeo-Christian consensus operated through different stages of its evolution. So to begin, we're going to talk about a need for an American dogma, originally observed by Alexis de Tocqueville as something that is really just true about American democracy, but also true about democracies generally. They don't need an American dogma, but they need their own dogma, and that this dogma is going to happen, that there's no way to deny its place, so it's best to decide on what that dogma will be. And then we'll proceed through the discarding of Protestant hegemony, the three stages of the Judeo-Christian consensus. One is Americanism, the second is the beloved community, and the third is the American dispensation, and then what happens after these have declined. So let's start with the need for American dogma, probably an issue that many of you are going to be uncomfortable with. But hear me out, because I have a very significant authority on my side. We're actually flanked by the Mansfield and Winthrop translations of Democracy in America right now. So you can whip open these books and find these quotations yourself if you're so inclined, because I have the citations here. But let's start with what he means. Dogmatic beliefs are opinions men receive on trust without discussing them. If each undertook himself to form his opinions and to pursue the truth down the paths cleared by him alone, it is not probably that a great number of men would ever unite in any common beliefs. Now, the thing is that we have these, even if they're not going to be like Christian dogma. And a great example of this is a man named Daniel Kahan wrote in his book on Tocqueville about the dogma over the meaning behind streetlights. We tend to, want to be individualistic and express ourselves in ways that are supposed to be authentic to our beliefs and experiment and democratic citizenship, the sort of Deweyan conception of American life. But when it comes to traffic signals, we actually want dogma. Or at least our insurance companies want dogma, right? Because if you decide, well, for me, red, yellow, and green always mean go, you're going to get into car accidents. And so we have dogmas that are set in stone this way. And a lot of recurring political debate over statues or over speech or over identity are actually still rooted in these ideas behind what dogmas we share or we don't share. And so we find that this issue of dogma is always coming to the surface. And the problem we often have is that we don't think we have one, and there needs to be a deliberation over what it looks like. So he says, democracy generates its own default dogma. It doesn't use the word default because he's not, he's a French aristocrat, not a computer scientist. And all that concerns the duties of citizens among themselves, the American has therefore become a subject. And all that regards only himself, he has remained a master. He is free and owes an account of his actions only to God. Hence this maxim that the individual is best as well as the only judge of his particular interest, and that society has the right to direct his actions only when it feels itself injured by his deed or when it needs to demand his cooperation. So this is the idea of individualism in Tocqueville, that the dogma is usually sort of, will find its way down to the individual and merely wishing to avoid any kind of direct state harm to their ability to express themselves. And so this conception requires adjustment if you want to impose any kind of more constructive commonality, because this is not the kind of dogma that facilitates common understanding or agreement. And this is religious dogma that he means. And now people get very unhappy with this presentation. Because here I am, right? I am bringing Tocqueville, a man of dubious religious fidelity, as an authority about why all of you should be religiously faithful. But Tocqueville's understanding of religious dogma is not one rooted necessarily in authentic belief or some sort of experience of divine grace or belonging to an eternal tradition or something like that. He only means this in terms of human questions. He says this in the opening of Democracy in America. He says that the first object and one of the principal advantages of religions is to furnish a solution for each of these primordial questions that is clear, precise, intelligible to the crowd, and very lasting. Therefore, one can say that every religion that remains within this circle I have just indicated, and that does not claim to leave it, as several have attempted to do so, in order to stop free ascent of the human mind in all directions, imposes a salutary yoke on the intellect. And so the only way that you can facilitate agreement among Americans, in his experience, is for them to share broadly held religious beliefs. In the absence of those beliefs, there will be tremendous disagreement because everyone will believe themselves to be the individual authority on all questions. And because their authority cannot be shared, right, it's by nature it is individual, there will be a tremendous amount of disagreement and fractious politics. Not that we would know what that's like today. So if your choice is between the individualism of disagreement and its absence of dogmatic belief and the facility of achieving consensus with religious belief, Tocqueville's going to always recommend the salutary yoke, which is why, despite his own sort of private reservations of religion, he seems to be very publicly observant in the United States. And he observes that like the people he meets who are like him, sort of reserved on these questions of religion, all agree with him that they should engage in public observance of religion in order to preserve the salutary yoke's influence in creating a common set of beliefs upon which people can build a consensus. And what's strange about this salutary yoke is that it does not depend on the old European approach to imposing that yoke, which was confessing a particular faith and then using state power to fund institutions of religion as monopolies on education and hospital and charity work. Instead, he directs to the very opposite position. And he does this in part because the French are, recovering from a revolution, and there was some dispute about the role of the church there. And he comes to the United States, and he notices that the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion are not opposed like they are in France. So he's astonished by this, and he finds that Catholic, Baptist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist preachers may all hate each other, but they all like the country, and none of them are asking to be in charge or to be confessionally established. And the reason for this, he sort of knows that the practical rule on the ground is no one would agree. No one has like a sufficiently large threshold for imposing their will on the others. In fact, that's in retreat when Tocqueville comes. There's only one state left that has an establishment, and shortly after he leaves the United States, they lose it. So what he observes is that religion is by and large disestablished, and this is what makes it so strong, in its ability to create a religious dogma as a salutary yoke. He says, religion sees in civil freedom a noble exercise of the faculties of man, and the political world a field left by the Creator to the efforts of intelligence. Free and powerful in its sphere, satisfied with the place that is reserved for it, it knows that its empire is all the better established when it reigns by its own strength alone and dominates over hearts without support. Freedom sees in religion the companion of its struggles and its triumphs, the cradle of its infancy and the divine source of its rights. It considers religion as a safeguard of its mores, and mores are the guarantee of laws and the pledge of its own duration. So there's this typo in there, which is very typical of me. But there's a kind of virtuous cycle here, where freedom assures the ability for individuals to exercise their conscience without coercion, to reach the consensus that such freedom is necessary because it is in comportment with our natural rights. And the religious beliefs in God as the guarantor of those rights then necessitates that freedom of conscience. And so where you find this separation of church and state, you find the respect for conscience and the respect for religious authority because it supplies the divine basis for that conscience. And in France, it did not operate this way. The spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion were vicious enemies. And the reason for this is that for the French, religion was an authority without question, in the same way that so was the crown. This is a bit, I'm being a little schematic here, but this is just to help create a contrast. And for the Republicans, the liberal Republicans that fought against monarchy and church, they saw them as arbitrary authorities seeking to impose arbitrary rule over the conscience. And so there was a great antipathy for each other that the United States just simply doesn't have. So, this is a slightly low resolution of what would have been a very common event. At the time Tocqueville was in the United States, this is a revival. And if you don't know what the revival period was, the Second Great Awakening, this is a remarkable period in American history. We're in one of the areas where many of the people who were awakened came. In fact, if you walk out, I noticed that there's like a very big Methodist church. They're one of the big denominations that are part of this revival. The religious revival is in many ways the thing that he's describing, Tocqueville, where there are by and large states with no establishments. The only one left is Massachusetts. I alluded to it earlier, and it's gone in 1833. And so where there is disestablishment, there is the enshrinement of freedom of conscience, which then empowered primarily low church or evangelical denominations to try to win souls, right? And what those denominations do is primarily preach this thing that Tocqueville's observing about the freedom of conscience. In fact, many of them, like especially what are called the New Light Presbyterians and the Methodists, tied two issues together with the freedom you get in the gospel. One of them is the demand to emancipate all slaves, and the other is to end all attachments to alcohol. And in many cases also that there's a connection between chattel slavery in the South and spiritual slavery in Rome. So there's some like anti-Catholicism that's at work there too. But this is part of the churn of the Second Great Awakening that is enormously important for understanding 19th century American political life as churches become sort of central gathering points and starting points for civic associations and political organization. Now, the trouble with this is that these different denominations don't agree with each other. Right? For example, Baptists and other denominations disagree over something called pedobaptism, which sounds bad, but just means baptizing babies. Baptizing babies is something Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Roman Catholics, and most denominations do, but Baptists are opposed to it because they want there to be a moment in which you, as an adult with reason, accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. And the idea of throwing water on a kid's head is meaningless because, they're Protestants, so sacraments have no efficaciousness. They're supposed to be an indication of something real that's already happened by faith. And a little baby can't, accept Jesus Christ as his or her personal Lord and Savior. So this was, a cause for real disagreement. In fact, one of the causes for the end of the 1833 Massachusetts disestablishment was pedobaptism. So what they have to do as a group, these Protestants, is essentially find a modus vivendi. Presbyterians, some of them are going to believe in limited atonement, the frozen chosen, as it's jokingly referred to. The New Lights don't. They're 4-point Calvinists. All of these divisions that may not mean anything to you were vitally important to settling public life. And so the way that they settled it was, well, we may not agree on doctrinal differences, but we agree that the Mormons and Catholics are a huge problem. So let's focus on that. And so this becomes the source for what's called Protestant hegemony. And Protestant hegemony means that what we all share together is a concept of Americanism, in which we understand that the broadly understood Protestant conception of Republican government in the United States, informed especially by the English Reformation and the English Enlightenment, is the guiding post for us. And that the external threats to this republic primarily can be found in the LDS Church and the whore of Babylon that we call Rome. My computer's about to restart. I would like it not to do that. It's just like snooze. So the high points for this period come with things like the Blaine Amendments, which are advocated by a man named James Blaine, who was part of a kind of Reconstruction government under Grant. They gathered a lot of steam during the Reconstruction government because of the peculiar partisan allegiances that formed during the 19th century. Irish Catholics were by and large disarmed by secession and Reconstruction. They had a lot of ties in the South because there was, the abolitionists were opposed to Catholicism and slavery. So the Catholics were like, oh well, who else do we got? Oh, So you imagine going to the DNC, right? And it's plantation owners and Irish Catholic dock workers. It's very strange. So this is a period where there's almost like a supermajority of northern evangelical Protestants that are seeking to keep Catholics from being able to access public money. And so much of this period is defined by this because the number of Roman Catholics in the United States is dramatically increasing, starting with a trickle from the French Revolution and French expats, as well as people just leaving Europe to get out of Dodge, right? It's not good there, to the really serious issue of Irish immigration during the famine, and then the tumult on the continent during the 1848 revolutions. There's large numbers of German Catholics that come too. So this Protestant hegemony exercises itself sometimes extra politically. You have Blaine Amendments. You also have the 1834, the 1834 Charleston nunnery or convent burning. There were widespread rumors that the convent was a source for debauchery and that women often were kidnapped and taken there for the purposes of pleasuring bishops. So there was a mob that came and burned down the convent. There was 10 years later in Philadelphia a riot over the Bible being translated from the Catholic Vulgate into English called the Douay-Rheims Bible. And so there was a riot in Philadelphia. This is a Missouri experience in which men covered their faces with gunpowder and assassinated Hiram and Joseph Smith in order to stop the spread of the LDS Church. Some of this has to be related to issues of Freemasonry. That's a little bit too much of a rabbit hole for our purposes. And of course, you found a lot of the expression of Protestant hegemony in cartoons. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon in which the Roman Church is depicted as an alligator. This was a very regular motif for him, because when you turn an alligator sideways with its mouth open, it looks like a bishop's mitre, which I'll be honest is actually pretty great. I'm Catholic. I'm from Ave Maria University. I think it's given away in the name. Our university literally means High Mary. So we have that. You can see his face right there. You can see it kind of struggling if you look underneath the maw. And then mysteriously, the tortoise represents the LDS Church, which I guess is supposed to be the tabernacle. I'm getting nods. Is that what that is? I don't know either. But he doesn't have a face. The LDS Church doesn't have a hidden face. It's just a turtle. And it says religious liberty guaranteed, but can we allow foreign reptiles to crawl all over us? With us also meaning the U.S. And I have to wonder, does Thomas Nast know that Joseph Smith was an American? But anyway. So this Protestant hegemony is very powerful in creating de facto establishments in the absence of a real establishment. And what ultimately breaks this establishment is the fundamentalist controversy at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So you'll often hear the term fundamentalist used as it pertains to multiple religions. Like during the War on Terror, you heard a lot about fundamentalist Islam, which is kind of an unusual thing to do because the fundamentalism movement is really a Protestant one, but there's this sort of like analogizing from the American experience to describe things that aren't quite right. But leaving that aside, in the 1900s there was a division over preserving Orthodox Protestant dogma among sort of ordinary middle-class clergy and their congregations versus like sort of theology professors influenced by German critical history or the products of scientific discovery, especially the theory of evolution, and which sort of higher-minded, higher-class individuals sought to update Christianity and remove some of what they saw as the superstitious elements that have been disproved. This also means placing the Bible under a greater degree of critical scrutiny that offended a lot of the more old-fashioned fundamentalist approaches. But fundamentalism here just refers to the fundamentals of the Christian religion and what they saw they were, and they actually write a series of books called The Fundamentals in Defense of Orthodoxy against the social gospel movement. And the story about these two is actually very interesting because the social gospelers are often the ones who are adapting their religion to Darwinism, so they'll believe in strange racial hierarchies, and this actually offends the egalitarianism of the fundamentalists, and so the story isn't usually one of all good and all bad. It's very complicated. But what ultimately matters the most is that finally, Fosdick throws down the gauntlet to end all of this nonsense, and the fundamentalists lose, it's broadly understood, because it's their leader at Princeton Theological Seminary, John Gresham Machen, has to leave, and he starts. Do you know what it's called, Rudy? Do you remember? Is it up there? Westminster, I should read my, but it's the lowest form of teaching to read off the slides, but sometimes you just got to do it. What's wrong with me? By the way, if you're a professor and you do that, it's okay when you do it. I don't want to offend anyone. So I should actually have a Imagining Judeo-Christian America by, I've forgotten her name. That's why I should have been up there, but there's a really outstanding book that should be up here too, but the two that influenced me originally, because her book came out at the same time as mine, were Matt Hedstrom's book and Kevin Schwartz's book on this transition. Now, you'll note that it says Judeo-Christian. I've not talked about Jews that much so far, and Jews actually are not going to play a significant role in the talk. We can talk about why in a little bit. But they play a major role here because the transition from Protestant hegemony to this Judeo-Christian approach requires buy-in from Catholics and Jews. In other words, they have to trust the Protestants after years of, maybe not. Although Catholics have more to suspect than Jews, the United States is generally philo-Semitic, except, with the Hoods and those guys. They weren't too nice to Jews. But the achievement of the new consensus is pretty difficult, but eventually there's Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, who are sympathetic, and Catholics are just excited not to have to deal with a lot of mistrust. And so what we end up with is this Judeo-Christian consensus really taking shape in the 1920s and 1930s, which means that it's only around 80 years old. And given the history of conflict among the faiths, it's always been very volatile. And in fact, here you see an unlikely trio. That's Rockefeller on the right, MLK in the middle, and Cardinal Francis Spellman on the left. You can't get more 60s than this photograph. It's incredible, right? But you have a liberal Republican, a Democratic Socialist Baptist minister, and one of the most, I'm at a Catholic university, a very interesting cardinal. Was very much a Paul, as much as he was a prince of the church, when a red hat confers. So this critical period is one in which they deliberate over ideas for common consensus. And we're going to talk about the stages here by referring to critical figures in each stage. Now, the funny thing about this consensus as it forms in the beginning under that Hedstrom and Schultz identify is that Protestants immediately the Protestants that were immediately responsible for this were primarily the modernists, the people at Princeton Theological Seminary. These were the people who saw themselves as opening up the leadership to include more people, while the fundamentalists stuck to a lot of their guns on issues of anti-Catholicism and the need for the full conversion of the Jews. So that's part of the reason why it happens with primarily Episcopalian, high church versions of Presbyterians, more high church Methodists, and generally speaking, more politically liberal. So what's funny is that upon this sort of broader conception of Judeo-Christianity as a consensus, one of the chief advocates was a Catholic, which is probably not what they intended when you have these Protestant divines opening up. But it happens that the reason for someone like Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen taking over is precisely because he had been trained to deal with the anti-Catholicism in the United States. Now, show of hands, who's ever heard of Fulton Sheen? That's way more than I expected. And that's, first of all, great. Second of all, so Sheen's actually up for canonization, which is currently like kind of in limbo. There was stuff going on in the investigations of the New York Archdiocese over, well, you know. And it's not that Sheen was suspected of anything. He'd actually already been cleared. But nobody wanted to take any chances. So Sheen had only been bishop in Rochester, which is when this would have mattered, for 2.5 years, because he was terrible as an administrator. So there was very little opportunity for any malfeasance, but he's since been cleared, and so very likely this is going to go through. So there's been a sort of a renewed interest in Fulton Sheen, which I'm really betting on, because I have him in my book. But the story behind him is that you probably know his Life is Worth Living television show. It won an Emmy, but really he begins his political engagement in the 1920s and 30s when he's giving speeches and radio addresses that were prompted by the 1928 presidential contest. One of the candidates, a man named Al Smith, who was Democratic governor of New York, was Catholic. He was an Irish Catholic. And this prompted a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic propaganda, and so Sheen sort of sought to counteract this. There were a lot of radio Catholics that were doing this, and Sheen was the one that stayed normal. The other one was Charles Coughlin, and he was not normal. And so what's funny is there's a rivalry between the two that's sort of beyond the scope of the talk, but we're glad that Sheen won. So Sheen advances a position called Americanism, and he says that the Declaration of Independence affirms what the gospel affirms as religion, the worth of man. Christ died on a cross for him, and governments are founded on account of him. He is the object of love theologically and politically, the source of rights, inalienable and sacred, because when duly protected and safeguarded, he helps in the creation of a kingdom of Caesar, which is the stepping stone to the kingdom of God. This sounds very much like what Tocqueville was describing religion doing, and here's Sheen repeating this sort of thing. And he's doing so very intentionally because he wants to prove that Catholics are loyal citizens, primarily considered not so because they thought, a lot of Protestants thought that Catholics had to dedicate themselves first and foremost to the Pope in Rome. And the popes in Rome didn't help with this, by the way. So Sheen has to kind of push on this, and the term that he uses, Americanism, is actually a pretty fraught term because it at once had been a subject for disagreement in the Vatican over its use. So now's the test. Will the audiovisual work? We were up here. We know the computer wants to restart, too, so there's a lot of tension up here. So this is Sheen on Life is Worth Living talking about Americanism.
First of all, the source of our rights of liberty. Where, for example, do I get the right of free speech here? Whence comes freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion? There's an audience here in this studio. They are an assembly. Whence comes the right of assembly? Don't you think that our founding fathers had to ask themselves these questions? Where do our rights come from? Liberties as well. From the state The state gave our rights. The state could take them away. Does the federal government give us our rights and liberties? If the federal government gave us our rights and liberties, the federal government could take them away. March the 15th, we feel it takes almost everything else away. It might take away our rights and liberties. Our founding fathers had to ask themselves these questions, and they searched about for some basis and some ground of our liberties. And they looked to one theory that was being held in Europe at the time. Namely, the rights and liberties come from Parliament. Founding fathers rejected that. And they considered another theory. That they come from the will of the majority. And rightly, they refused to accept that view. They wanted a country in which rights and liberties did not come from the will of the majority in election. They wanted a country in which the majority would be the custodian of minority rights. And they finally found the source of rights and liberties, and they set it down in the second paragraph of our Declaration of Independence. It is a self-evident principle that the Creator, endowed man with certain unalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Now, we don't see it or hear it necessarily, but Sheen, by saying our founding fathers, is making a political statement. I'm an Irish Catholic grown up in Illinois, and they're my founding fathers too. I'm not Irish Catholic. I don't sound that good. That slight brogue. And of course, when he's making this political statement, he's saying this as an Emmy Award winner. Sheen at this point had won the Emmy for the best TV personality. He was regularly beating Frank Sinatra in Friday Night Fights in the time slot. Tremendous reach in terms of his political statements. So when he is saying this, it's done with full conscience. Fully conscious of the amount of weight and how some people will find this controversial. There's this funny story about Sheen where Baptist ministers would kind of watch the show and then rip off some of Sheen's best lines, and then the Baptists in the audience couldn't call the preacher on it because that means they were watching too. And this is the sort of evolution of the public acceptability among certain parts of Protestant America. And here you see Sheen, much older, talking to religious revivalist Billy Graham. These two men are two of the three people most responsible for the religious revival of the post-war era. We're going to talk about the third in a minute. But you can see here this expression of the Judeo-Christian consensus as forming the basis of these rights and liberties, the acknowledgement of the rights and liberties that we have coming from God that he just talked about in that clip. Jews, Protestants, and Catholics alike, and all men of goodwill, are realizing that the world is serving their souls with an awful summons, the summons to heroic efforts at spiritualization. We plead for a unity of religious peoples, wherein each marches separately according to the light of his conscience, but strikes together for the moral betterment of the world, a unity through prayer, not hate. We may not be able to meet in the same pew, would to God that we could, but we can meet on our knees. And this is in a book, you'll see this, Communism and the Conscience of the West, which in a way is important to note because Sheen he's known for a lot of things. He's known for being incredibly anti-communist. And communism essentially becomes what the Judeo-Christian consensus opposes, whereas the Protestant hegemony had hated Catholicism. And there's like similarities in the way that it's treated. Communism is an international conspiracy of elites infiltrating all of our institutions to overthrow them and place them under despotism. It's like, are you writing a plea for the West, or are you, writing communism, the conscience of the West? It's an interesting sort of subversion, and Sheen's doing it, knowing full well what he's doing. In his defense, there were communists trying to do that. So I mentioned there were three figures of religious revival: Billy Graham and Fulton Sheen. The third one is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This book wouldn't be credible if I didn't mention him as one of these figures, considering how effective he was in using this language. Now, when he does use Judeo-Christian, he uses a different version. He says Hebraic Christian. And I don't have a reason for why he does that. It might have just been an aesthetic preference, but it's one that he uses all the same. Now, I hope I don't need to introduce him too much, but of course begins his career in '57 with the Montgomery Improvement Association, originally selected by the sort of assembled ministers, black ministers of the Montgomery black church community, and picked because he was the youngest and thought most easily malleable from behind the scenes. And, it didn't work out that way. Dies after being assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. So the language you get about the kind of foundation he has in mind is here in this quotation: "For the salvation of our nation and the salvation of mankind, we must follow another way. This does not mean that we abandon our righteous efforts. With every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid this nation of the incubus of segregation, but we shall not in the process relinquish our privilege and our obligation to love." This term love is very important for understanding King. "While abhorring segregation, we shall love the segregationist. This is the only way to create the beloved community." So the challenge that King always had, which made him eventually unpopular within his own movement, was that segregationists need to be confronted with the opposite tactics that they use. And what they need is to have their conscience provoked, and not just their consciences, but also the consciences of onlookers. Because the engagement is not merely between us and them, it's also with the broader American people who are going to place judgment upon us. So we need to convict ourselves to act in loving ways and prove that to the American people that our side is on the side of right. And that is only a conclusion King believed they could reach if they were part of the Hebraic Christian consensus, which he believed they were. And he was always affirming that they were. So when there's like rocks thrown at people marching in a nonviolent way, they're supposed to not respond with violence. If there are dogs, water cannons, always marching forward, never using violence back. And he would tell people not to come to marches if they thought they couldn't. And so the whole principle of the beloved community for King is based off of this kind of emergent experience where a person who loves the other for their own sake, this idea of agape or sacrificial love, begins in the heart of a person who's been saved. And then they show that conviction in conflict with those who are committing violence. And what propagates from their example is more witness of that loving, that sacrificial love, that will produce more people like that person. So eventually the beloved community will emerge as this community becomes affected by this sacrificial love. So it is kind of like this emergent property done by convicting yourself to behave in a nonviolent way. And things were very encouraging for King for doing this during the Montgomery Improvement Association. There's a kind of lull in his success because he does something very unusual. And it's partly to help fund a national campaign to do this under the SCLC. He publishes a book called Stride Towards Freedom, which is an excellent book. It really holds up. The problem is, it's like publishing your entire playbook as a college football team. It's like, I want to make a lot of money for my team, so I'm going to tell, this is how we do everything. And so all of the people who wanted to stop King's success read this book, and they're like, oh, this is the whole strategy behind the plan. We're going to just not arrest him. And if things are going on in our city, we're just going to tell everyone to close their stores until he runs out of steam. And this is why King, from 58 until 63 really has a lot of trouble getting the SCLC off the ground until Bull Connor shows up in Birmingham and is so awful. Right? He's awful and is stuck in a political fight that Birmingham affords him the opportunity to engage in this strategy again, and it works even better than it did in Montgomery. But one thing that often you hear about this approach to the beloved community as a foundation, which is an overtly Judeo-Christian, Hebraic-Christian approach, is that over time King becomes more secular and more radical. You often hear this. And this is sort of true. King feels less compunction about hiding his democratic socialism and his economic point of view. And partly it's because, after the Great Society begins, this sort of view is sort of part of at least a faction of the Democratic Party, and they're often the faction that are most supportive of him. So there's really no reason for him to be a little bit reluctant about this. But he remains fundamentally a person who believes in this foundation, even when it's no longer in his interest. And that's why in the next video, we're going to watch King in 67. Because you're going to hear language that sounds like King from 57. And he keeps using it because even though he could be abandoning this position and taking on a more black nationalist approach to black power and resistance to white supremacy, he doesn't use that language here at all. He doubles down in 67, right, when he's considerably diminished in his political reputation because he no longer has an in with the Johnson administration. He's denounced the Vietnam War. The last thing that he could sell King as an alternative leader to people like Stokely Carmichael was that at least he had an in with Johnson. Well, he doesn't anymore. But here he is sticking to his guns, although when you see him, he's very tired. This is not the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom King. This is a very tired and almost broken King. Sorry, this is as loud as I can get it.
Though we may be, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. Lord Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. For the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without me. They made country change. They built a home to their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. Yet out of abundant vitality, they continue to grow into them. I say that if the inexpressible atrocities of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're not aware now, freedom. Suppose the sacred incarnation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are recorded in our echoing land. So I still say we shall overcome because all of the world universe is long for the business for us. We shall overcome because compromise, right? No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because we become triumphant, right? The rise again. We shall overcome because faith was the Lord is right. To forever on the scaffold, long forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways to feet.
So you can hear it, if you can hear it, you can hear that it's a little, staid. It's also partly the venue, but by 67, King's been through a lot. And the language that you're getting about the beloved community is very similar in 57 to 67, where he's talking about that God assures the future of racial reconciliation despite all the crimes, all of the violence. And so this Hebraic Christian consensus is what allows for, in fact, it is the only basis for racial reconciliation and ultimately a beloved community. In the final analysis, racial justice must be uprooted Injustice must be uprooted from American society because it is morally wrong. It must be uprooted because it stands against all the noble precepts of our Hebraic Christian heritage. The Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation deserve to live in sacred honor. Many generations of Americans suffered, bled, and died, confident that those who followed would preserve the purity of our ideals. Once again, the Declaration cited. You saw it in Sheen, you see it here. Now, this is the part of the talk when people start to get a little mad. Because when you look at Sheen, you're like, oh, I don't know who that is. Oh, he seems pretty great. You might have more sympathy with communists. I don't know. But even if you do, Sheen at least he's saying things that sound okay. And of course, if you don't like MLK, that's your fault. But now we're going to talk about Jerry Sr. And I'll tell you what, when I was first putting this together, I was like, people really don't like Jerry Sr. And I'll tell you, the best thing to ever happen to Jerry Falwell Sr. was Jerry Falwell Jr. It's like, oh, how good we had it. At least that guy wore a coat and tie, stayed completely dressed. It was faithful to his wife. And if you know anything about Jerry Sr., you'll know that it is not a surprise that Jerry Jr. turned out the way that he did. Falwell came from a family of rum runners. The Falwells were not a great family in Lynchburg, Virginia. The father was an alcoholic and got into a fight with his brother. This is Jerry Sr.'s father, so Jerry Jr.'s grandfather, and killed his brother. And that was part of the reason he went from an alcoholic to just like suicidal amount of alcohol that he consumed a day. Has a deathbed conversion, just a long-suffering wife who's a very devout Baptist. And this is part of what gets Jerry Sr. to clean his life up. So it's very much part of that family to have these problems in there. And in a funny way, like Jerry Sr. had two sons, and the other son is more like Jerry Sr. than the grandfather. So anyway, so Falwell here is not meant to be an example of someone who we're supposed to hold to the same kind of respect and admiration that you might have of King or Sheen. It's really meant to be more of an example of how people use the Judeo-Christian consensus. So this isn't meant to be an apologia for Jerry Falwell Sr. Please don't mistake that for what I'm doing here. Rather, he uses it in a way that is very similar to Sheen and King. And for that, let me just, for a moment, just explain some of the things you might have noticed already that are similar. The first is media. Like Sheen adopts radio in the 1920s, right? And he wires loudspeakers on St. Patrick's in New York so that when people were coming to hear his homilies on Sundays, they could hear them outside. Then he goes to television, right? He's using paperback books, which we don't often think about as a major advancement, but books used to be expensive. Paperbacks make them cheap. You have pulp paper like comic books and newsprint. That's what those books are made out of. And if you go see the originals that Sheen used, or that were published by the National Council of Catholic Men that helped publish his work, I mean, we're talking like, this stuff tears in your fingers right now. So you COA archives, and I didn't tear them, right? I was very good about not doing that, but some of this stuff does not age well. And what the problem that King had is that he's at an affluent Black Baptist church in Montgomery, but not affluent enough to like buy a TV station, or even not that anyone in the local TV or radio stations would have wanted him. So he had to generate his own media attention by staging demonstrations. And there's this weird scene in a great book by S. Jonathan Bass called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, in which he and Abernathy and one other figure whose name slipped my mind see that they're starting to get Birmingham police showing up and engaging in violence with demonstrators, and they're actually excited. It sounds crazy, but it's the first time they were actually able to get newsworthy demonstration of what white supremacy in the South looks like. So at one point they're like jumping, they're saying, we got a movement, we got a movement, they put the dogs on us. We got a movement. So, this is the only way that King gets coverage. Sheen could find his own by going to affiliates. Well, guess what Falwell did? He started on long-abandoned AM radio stations, syndicated all over the country, made a ton of money off of his radio ministry, and bought his own radio station. So now he can control the broadcast and then sends out over this broadcast and many other public broadcasts a television show called the Old Time Gospel Hour. And the Old Time Gospel Hour becomes essentially like a second church for a lot of people who may go to church. But then they have, it's almost like a cross between a kind of a church service and a variety show. There's a lot of like singing of old-time religion classics and gospel music. And if you go back and watch it, it's very kitschy, but it is in its own way sort of charming. But the thing is that Falwell, during the early stages of developing his church, was opposed to any kind of participation in politics altogether. And that's because he was what's called a double separationist independent Baptist. It's a lot. So double separationist means separation from public life and separation from all non-independent Baptists. So this is a very isolated church. But what happens is he has a very important conversation with New Right conservative activist Richard Viguerie and a few others, Phillips and some of these other figures. I can't remember Phillips' first name. Do you remember Phillips? They have a conversation with him. They said, look, this is the position that we stand for in the new conservative movement. We think that there's a lot of crossover here with the things that you're saying. And this happens in the 70s, and this is when you see the double separationism go. And Falwell begins to hold the 1976 We Love America rallies, and that's when he becomes much more of an advocate for Judeo-Christianity. But you'll notice, again, what is it? It's conservative. And this is the major shift that occurs. Sheen is broadening by claiming a Catholic position within the Judeo-Christian consensus. King is claiming a black church tradition that was not supposed to be there originally, or was not originally thought to be the primary stage. Now you have the fundamentalists. They're back. Falwell was a fundamentalist. All right, he believed in the young earth creation. He believed in the idea that there would be 1,000 years in which the effects of the fall would be reversed, and we would like be walking around with pet lions, you know, and this way of viewing the world is now part of the Judeo-Christian consensus when it had very intentionally abandoned it. But in coming back, it does so by identifying that consensus with a particular ideological movement. And this is both because he's claiming it as such, but also because many on the opposite side, many on the left, have abandoned it too. So this is where the decline of the Judeo-Christian consensus really begins, because it is ceded by one ideological faction to the other, and then it becomes politicized. This is the beginning of that process. So we have here a term dispensation. And does anyone know what this term means within the framework? Yeah, what is a dispensation?
Oh, I'm thinking of dispensationalism, probably.
Yes, that's exactly right. What's dispensationalism?
It's the idea that humanity is divided, human history is divided into various separate dispensations, and God is made differently in each dispensation.
That's right. So this is based off of an interpretation of time in the Bible by a guy named Schofield. And he was a student of the Schofield Bible, and I highly recommend, if you want to see some real like deep lore of America, some deep canon, go through the Schofield Bible. There's periodizations of the different things that are occurring. And for the United States, we're in something called the church age. And the American dispensation in the church age is that this is the last great hope for evangelization of the world before the coming of the end times. And the end times is when you have the rapture, 1,000-year reign, you know, and then afterwards, like all the other stuff in Revelation that's part of the Schofield Bible, we kind of associate with this. And this is why Falwell says this: we have said that we believe America to be a nation founded by our forefathers as a Christian nation and as a base for world evangelization. See, there's that American dispensation. There is much evidence to support that statement. No wonder that for 200 years God has blessed this country beyond all others simply because here in our environment of freedom and liberty, America has for 2 centuries been allowed to give the gospel out to a world for whom Jesus died, more so than any nation in history, and yet we begin to see our country, our republic, crumbling. We see a moving away from God and away from principles responsible for her greatness. We therefore feel that it's high time for the people of God to awaken out of their sleep. And are we going to be 3 for 3? Okay. Yes. Oh, we're not going to hear that. Yeah, you can't hear that. Okay, so we're 2 for 3. That's okay. So what he says here, essentially, is that we believe that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and there are a lot of us. This is the big addition here. It's almost like a version of the failing New York Times motif you might remember from the previous president. But instead it was the failing mainline churches. That where you have found an abandonment of the fundamentals, you have found a diminution of the number of people who believe. And at this time, in 82, when he's giving the speech, the number of Americans who were having born-again experiences, defined themselves as evangelical, who were disaffiliating from traditional denominations like the Methodists, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians, were now becoming independent Baptists, Southern Baptists, Pentecostal. And so what he's saying is that we are on the side of the winners. And people know this. They know that we're preaching the truth. That's why they're leaving you and coming to us. And a political movement that we lead will be the one that will ultimately be responsible for reversing the harms that a previous or almost apostate class has imposed upon this country. And he's saying this in the Falwell style that's sort of like Elmer Gantry combined with a high school football coach. And that sounds very mean, and it is, but it's also true. And he was very effective in talking about this. But one of the things about Falwell that people forget was that he was also like kind of fond of being open to criticism. This is so who's this? He was here at Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. Well, it's Senator Ted Kennedy, a person who did not like Falwell, and Ted Kennedy's Irish Catholic. Falwell probably said some nasty things about his people back in the day. But the reason why Falwell liked to do this was because even though he was conservative with a capital C, one of the points behind the Judeo-Christian consensus was to cross these lines. So here he is trying to cross a partisan line, include an opposition view so that they can reach a consensus again. Now, the way that Falwell frames it in the American dispensation makes this very difficult. But, this is an improbable picture. You probably did not think this ever happened, but this happened more than once. And as a result of those 20 years of more permissiveness, and as a result of nearly 20 years of repudiation of the Judeo-Christian perspective, traditional and family values, we saw a drug epidemic begin that today has paralyzed the minds and bodies of millions of our young people and continues to do so. We forgot the God who made us and who established us, but thank God, as I bring the message on the subject of the healing of America, there is a process and in progress in this country today, a moral and spiritual rebirth that is undeniable. Right, so he's tying this kind of evangelical revivalism, the kind of stuff from the old-time gospel hour, which itself was influenced by radio gospel hours from when he was a kid. And he's tying that to a conservative, mostly a Ronald Reagan movement. It's not a coincidence that he's saying this in 87 and that he closes down shop at the moral majority, his political outfit, in 88. Right, Reagan's done. Right, so Falwell. Now Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition can take over, and Falwell can get back to running his media empire. The problem is that after Falwell, you have a reluctance on the left really to engage in any kind of religious consensus, believing it all to be, either exclusionary or just superstition. And on the right, you have this increasing ownership of the Judeo-Christian consensus. And so Americans begin to associate the consensus with the right. And there's a period since the 80s and 90s when church affiliation has been decreasing, and often when asked, the reason for people leaving churches is because there's an expected political position at that church. They can't leave the politics at the door, and so the politics is right there at the pulpit. And this is the issue that we call the culture wars today that really have never left us. And the reason why this causes a problem is that this is a breakdown of that spirit of liberty and religion, because there's no longer consensus of settled beliefs, but instead now very unsettled beliefs in which you have the party of religion on the right and the party of irreligion on the left. So that is the end. I know that was a little long, but I tried to make some space for the actual subjects to give their language, although I know you are all feeling a little cheated that you didn't get to hear Falwell. So thank you very much.
Dr. Patterson's going to take some questions. In the back.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
What your perspective is on the future of fourth religion in politics. And after Virtue McIntyre said was waiting for the new St. Benedict.
Right.
I'm curious, what do you think the future is between church and state?
So the contemporary situation is that your generation is less religious than my generation, which is less religious than the generation before it. And this is a cause for a lot of calamity talk, right? There's even like you see it in Falwell talking about like the fate of the nation and the like. But what's really interesting is that this can only be a way of thinking if you assume that the common state of affairs was the religious revival of the 50s and early 60s. So where 90% of the country is claiming to be some kind of religion, and many of them are regularly attending services. And that's just simply not the case today. And actually, the case that we have today is more similar to the way America's normally been, which is culturally Protestant with lots of religious minorities and a tendency to increase the rate of attendance upon family formation. But that's really where the difference lies, is that family formation is increasingly delayed. It was delayed by our generation. It's going to be even more delayed, and this is based off of the expected income that you can have to have children. And childbearing and church attendance are the things that go together. So the longer you wait, the less likely, even upon getting married and maybe having children, you'll actually go back. And so where you have families that don't go back, then you have families that are just not religious. And the children in those families never go back because they never went. And so you're seeing this slow sort of increase in the number of atheist and agnostic people in the United States. But again, we've seen this before. This was actually the conditions of the early republic, because normally what this means is that this is the dry tinder on the ground for another burning over the country with religious revivals. So you may be telling your grandkids, I remember back in the day when people used to smoke weed on the streets.
Charles, then I'll come here.
I'm wondering how you see ascriptive white supremacist Protestant movements like the Know Nothings in the early mid-19th century and the Second Klan, which are both identify as truly Protestant, truly American, and engage in these sorts of repressive tactics. How do they fit into this story? Do you see them as aberrations from this kind of emerging normal hegemonic consensus, or do you see them more as thinking scholars like Roger Smith, Michael Rogan, for example, wrote on demonology, who they say we sometimes think of those kinds of movements as peripheral violences at the periphery, but really, if you think about it, it's actually more kind of central to how the American state and community works. So I don't know, just. Yeah.
So Roger Smith is a very important influence on this book. And the other person I'm thinking of is Moroni, who writes a book back in 2003 on this subject. I have a lot of problems with the Moroni book, but he does put those together in a way which doesn't minimize their importance. So they show up twice in my book. The first is that the sort of Know Nothing and Second Klan, they are part of this kind of history of anti-Catholicism in the Sheen chapter. And the reason for this is that they were given a central place in the Democratic Party, right, during Sheen's time. And before that, the Know Nothings, of course, are an essential faction of the formation of the Republican Party, Although having a know-nothing past becomes a problem for people because they become unable to be elected to a lot of national offices. And the second Klan is also a big part of the sort of populist wing of the Democratic Party. So they're part of the efforts to minimize their role, and they're the people that Sheen is actually attacking. In fact, I said the term Americanism is kind of a fraught term. There are two other people that use the term Americanism before Sheen. The first is opponents to America in the Catholic Church in Europe. And they don't like Americanism. They associate American acceptance of Republican government as bad, and that America should become a confessional monarchy. They're like, so you have like these old like French priests, who can't let go of like Louis XV, right? So they call America they call it Americanism when they say you should accept the Third Republic, and they're like, no, go back to your country full of Freemasons, and Jews. So that's the whole issue. Yeah. And the other people who use the term Americanism contrasted it with Romanism, and those were the know-nothings and the Klansmen. So the other time that this topic comes up is in the King chapter, and the debate on the floor in the United States Senate is one where this vision, it's a slightly whitewashed version of the Klan narrative of white Protestantism is the chief rhetorical object used by white Southern senators in opposition to the Civil Rights Act. And proponents of the Civil Rights Act adopt King's language of the beloved community in order to combat it. It's also worth noting that early Falwell he played a little bit with this stuff too. So it's there throughout the whole book. It never really goes away.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed your talk a lot. I was wondering if you see a Cold War frame for any of this. You alluded to it, the emergence of the consensus, but then you didn't really talk about it when you talked about the demise of the consensus. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that.
That's a good point. I should have maybe talked about it a little bit more. I was afraid. I took out my phone and saw that.
Plenty. You talked about plenty.
I saw it in an hour, and I was like, okay, wrap it up. No, that is a very big part of creating the conditions for a willingness to form a consensus. If you have an existential threat that is viewed as atheist, militantly atheist, and persecutes religious people. Sheen made great use of this, right? When you saw him in the show with the pectoral cross on his chest, he would point out early in the series that this cross didn't belong to him. It was actually one that was sent to him because it had previously belonged to a Russian Orthodox bishop who'd been liquidated and sent to the Gulag. So he was good at this sort of stuff. King, of course, had to constantly fend off accusations that he was a communist. One of his chief early fundraisers and influence men was a former member of the Communist Party, and Hoover figures this out pretty quickly and starts to plant little seeds all over the place. So you find like all these sermons that King has to give early on in which he explains the problems he has with communism. But as we know, like he harbored pretty strong democratic socialist views, but the democratic part was what kept him from wanting to be a communist. Falwell was, he could red bait with the best of them. He was very fond of doing that. And so as a ideological instrument, it was very useful for reminding people of what the alternative was. You saw like a kind of effort to revive that approach with terrorism, right, and the global war on terror. But then, like, this becomes a problem because Muslims are religious, right? They're not militant atheists, And so this is, on the one hand, we have to get rid of the Islamo-fascists, as they were once called. On the other hand, it's a religion of peace, and you had like Bush trying to like split the difference here, and it just didn't work the same way. So like the defeat of communism in a way makes a Judeo-Christian consensus more difficult to articulate. So that's a very, very perceptive point.
So many.
I was
Being the
wondering,
first I saw. So.
thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the regional dimensions of this, because my image of particular kind of Southern Protestantism is of John F. Kennedy coming and saying, try to justify himself
Texas.
of it into the 1960s. And I was just wondering, is this something that's kind of a national picture, or does it vary across different regions?
So this is great because I have not thought of this question, and no one's asked it before. But I guess we have two Southerners, and Sheen was a Midwestern Irish Catholic who got out of the Midwest as soon as humanly possible. He went from Peoria, outside of Peoria, Illinois, to Louvain, where he did his graduate work. Then he went to England for a year, and then lived in either Washington or New York. He was, part of the Acela clerical class. Right? The South is oddly more religious, at least in its expectations. And this is owing to the fact that during the early 20th century, the South had more of that Protestant hegemony. It had not been a source for as much emigration to the United States. Immigration was primarily in the mid-Atlantic and northern areas, because that's where the industrialization was most concentrated, and hence the amount of labor demand was highest, whereas post-Civil War South is an economic basket case, made worse by the fact that the people governing those states would rather impose Jim Crow laws that hobbled the economies of those states instead of actually pursuing their public welfare. It's an incredible book by a guy named Lewis Harvey Blair in 1889. It's about how segregated schools means we pay twice as much for education when we make half as much as the average northern state, so we're impoverishing ourselves. But so this is one of the reasons why you have way more practice with religious pluralism in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, with obvious lessons, like the Bible riots and the church, the convent burning under their belt, so they knew how to handle it. And when Kennedy goes to Texas, it's very much, I'm coming from a successful Irish Catholic family that is integrated into the United States and fought in the Second World War, right? He lost his brother, he was shot down, and we're coming down to Texas, and I'm going to say to you the things that you already believe about what I'm supposed to do when the Pope says something, which is the Pope can have his opinion, but I'm president of this country. And what's funny is that when he makes that claim, he says he's doing it on the basis of Catholic authority of John Courtney Murray, who doesn't come up. You may have noticed, I intentionally don't talk about Murray, because he was not a well-known figure. Sheen, wins the Emmy. Murray isn't even allowed to publish until the 50s, because he's under a ban by the Cardinal Ottaviani in the Vatican. And so what Kennedy's able to do in the 60 campaign is essentially to build off of all the work that Sheen and other Catholics have been doing. And not just him, like Dorothy Day, and let's not forget the work of the Notre Dame football team, right? And so he's able to say, I'm an American. I'm gonna do American things. I'm not a Catholic that's first or an Irishman first. And you just simply don't have that as much of an issue in the Midwest, where there's lots of Catholics, like Pittsburgh, in St. Paul, Minnesota, or in the West, where you have considerably less emphasis on these kinds of questions. When you get out to the West, like the questions of pluralism were actually based off of East Asian migration, so they just weren't as religiously charged. But that's an excellent question, and that was like me just riffing because I hadn't thought about it that way.
So, friends, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go have some refreshments. Dr. Pepper's certainly going to stick around. You can't leave. And you
I'm
get
cornered.
a chance to talk to him. But if you can just join me in thanking Dr. Pepper.
They didn't get that Falwell, though.
The whole time I was afraid of this thing.